Okay, guys, so we're going to move on to chapter 24 today, and it's going to discuss the growth of Western democracies in the century from the end of when Napoleon was causing up all that trouble in Europe until 1914, when a major event takes place that is a very pivotal point in world history, although we really don't give it the attention it deserves here in the United States because, well, we got involved a little late. And we're going to start, as we so often do, with the British. Why? Because they're the first, really, to make these moves towards democracy. And so, I mean, we pick up the concept really from them originally. So they're the first, other than, I guess, the United States, who are really going to make major steps towards long lasting and permanent democracy. So by 1815, the United Kingdom was a constitutional monarchy. They've got a parliamentary style government and two major political parties. The Tories, which were the party that supported a stronger monarchy, a more active and powerful ruler, and the Whigs, who supported the supremacy of Parliament uh, and a reduction in the authority and power of the king. And in 1815, it's still, believe it or not, King George III, but not for much longer. By 1815, he's very old. Um, However, it's not super democratic. Less than 5% of the population could vote. You had to be a guy, you had to be a member of the Church of England, you had to be a property owner, you had to be a certain age. Race was not a consideration, actually, but you couldn't be Catholic or Jewish or anything but Church of England. Women were not allowed to vote. Matter of fact, they won't be allowed to vote in England for till the very end of this era. And even then, they had to be 30 years old. They had to be older than men who were voting. And there were a lot. The biggest thing, though, was the property requirement. Because of that property requirement, they had these things called rotten boroughs. This was areas that had a member of parliament assigned to them. Members of parliament were assigned to a geographical region, to a district, just like we do with our members of the House of Representatives here. But in some of those districts, which they called boroughs, in some of those boroughs, there were like a dozen people who were qualified to vote. And you didn't even have to live in the borough to be returned from, that's the term that they use, returned from the borough as their member of parliament, which, by the way, is abbreviated MP after your name when you're an active member of parliament, versus PM, which is prime minister. Anyway, so these were called rotten boroughs because you could literally buy a seat in Parliament simply by bribing the right people in these rotten boroughs, and you just needed like 7 or 8 votes, and you could become the member of Parliament and have all the voting privileges of every other member of Parliament. Um, However, all that said, at the time, it was still the most democratic European nation of the day. Not the most democratic in the world. U.S. was more democratic. But in Europe, yes, absolutely. And that includes well, at that point, the Kingdom of France again. It was back to a monarchy after having been the empire. Um, in 1832, they're going to start changing things. And what they do is they reduce some of the requirements, which increases the electorate. That's the people who are eligible to vote. And most importantly, they redrew the parliamentary lines and eliminated those rotten boroughs. So now you actually had to stand for election. You actually had to run for election. And at this time, there was a political movement. It really started up in the north, and they put out some demands, and it was not the most uh, benign of movements. It was a little violent in some cases, but they demanded things that we think of as pretty normal. They wanted universal male suffrage. Basically, if you were a guy and a citizen or a subject of the United Kingdom, you should be allowed to vote. They wanted annual elections. They did not hold elections annually. They did it sort of haphazardly. It was sort of a kind of a whenever sort of situation. And this is an issue when it's sometimes it's called the Australian ballot because Australia was the first place that actually adopted this. But a secret ballot where nobody knew who you were when you voted. Before this, when you went and voted, everybody saw who you voted for. So everybody knew who you had voted for. Well, that can lead to, some voter intimidation, right? If say you work for a factory and the factory owner is running for parliament and he's standing there watching you vote, uh, who do you think you're likely to vote for? Your boss or the other guy? Of course, you're probably going to vote for your boss. So um, that's why the secret ballot is a big deal. Is that it helps to eliminate that sort of way of intimidating people into voting one way or another. Through most of this period, Her Majesty Queen Victoria I, by grace of God, Queen of the United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Ireland and Empress of India, ruled the United Kingdom of Britain. And as a result, the era is known by her name. It's the Victorian Age. And that's how powerful Britain and Her Majesty were. Queen Victoria ruled from 1837 to 1901, the longest of any British monarch, until her great great granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II, surpassed her back in 2015. Old George III is in third place. He lasted for 59 years and 96 days. Queen Victoria embodied the ideals of the age in the era that she reigned. She was dutiful. She was thrifty. One of the first things she did as queen with the income that she was given by Parliament was to pay off her father's gambling debts. She was big on honesty and hard work, working your way up through merit. She absolutely supported the reforms of the army where they stopped selling commissions, for example. And respectability. Respectability was a big thing during the Victorian age. It was huge, not just for yourself, but for your whole family. And that meant to act in the ways that society expected you to. As long as you did that, you were modest, you were hardworking, you were pious, you were seen to go to church and things. As long as you had these at least public attributes, then you were considered respectable, and that was a very important thing. To be accepted in society was to be respectable, and yet at the same time, some of the most popular people were those who publicly denied being respectable. So it's an interesting sort of dichotomy in that and it's sort of the same now. Most of the time people want, act kind of conformist in kind of the same way and gain acceptance that way. But man, we still like that outsider, that cool, you know, rebel without a cause kind of person. Um, so it's just interesting that they had the same sort of views. During her reign, Britain will expand its empire to its greatest extent. Most of her subjects had a very strong spirit of optimism during her reign, and it was as if the British Empire was, and to be British was a blessing. And here we have a few images that I like. The central image is Her Majesty, of course, Queen Victoria. This is later in life. This is after her husband has passed. She started to put on weight because she comfort ate a lot. Um, to the upper left is an image of Britannia, sort of a personification of the concept of Britain itself. And of course, the shield is the Union Jack, the symbol of the United Kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. You'll notice that the woman it's Athena, goddess of wisdom, and in her hand she holds a trident, symbol of warfare on the sea, because Britain, of course, was such a powerful naval power. Um, so going clockwise from there, let's go to the picture of the gentleman, the hefty gentleman with the Union Jack waistcoat or vest on, and his beautiful little bulldog. This is the male personification of an Englishman, and his nickname is John Bull. He's the bluff country squire type, prosperous and upstanding and outdoorsy, and apparently loves dogs. And that's great because it's a great dog. Below him is a photograph of a poet, Mr. Rudyard Kipling. And Kipling is the poet of the empire. He was Anglo-Indian, that is, he is of English descent, but born in India, born and raised there, came back to England for his education, lived in England for several years as he was with family as he was being educated, and then returned to India, where he became a journalist and a writer. And he wrote poems and stories and everything about the empire, and he was very, very positive and supportive of the empire and its ideals. Absolutely believed that the empire was a good thing for the world, and that it brought civilization and culture and uplifted all of the places in which it was. Now, that's not entirely accurate, but it is how a lot of people felt, and he tapped into that, and so he became the poet laureate of Britain as a result. And the last photo there, the last picture there, is a picture which shows various animals, and each of the different animals is a different nation. And the big lion is, of course, the United Kingdom. It's England. The bear is Russia. The dachshund with the pointy helmet is Prussia, Germany. Basically, the buzzard with the fez, that's Turkey. The dog with the plumed hat, that's Italy. The wolf is, I believe, Austria. And the kitty cat is France. I don't know why they used a kitty cat for France. Usually they use a rooster. Considering that she got an entire era named after her, I want to talk a little bit more about Queen Victoria than your book really talks about. Victoria was born Victoria of the House of Hanover, actually Princess Alexandrina Victoria of the House of Hanover, and would become Her Majesty Queen Victoria Saxe-Coburg-Gotha when she married. And so the dynasty will change when she marries. They change names. She took her husband's family on. Something that Her Majesty Elizabeth II did not do. She'll reign from 1837. She was barely 18 years old when her uncle died, and she became queen. Therefore, she avoided having a regency council until she died in 1901. She married her first cousin, Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and had 9 children with him, which is funny because she hated being pregnant. But she really didn't like small children. She thought newborns were ugly. The idea of breastfeeding was just disgusting to her. They hired wet nurses, and anyway, so she didn't like babies, but she loved her children very much. Unusually for monarchs, she and the Prince Consort Albert were very much in love. And you can see it in the things that she wrote. She wrote prodigiously, by the way. It's estimated, she kept a journal and she wrote lots of letters and things. It's estimated that she averaged about 2,500 words per day, handwritten. This is back in the days when everything was handwritten. that she wrote. So prodigious writer. We have a lot of records from her. There are some things that the royal family won't release. I mean, it's the property of the family, of course. Um, anyway, so when Albert dies in 1865, I believe it was, she's just devastated. Um, she starts to wear widow's weeds, the black clothing, and she wears that for the rest of her life. She basically stays in mourning the rest of her life. Although there are two men who were her personal servants, who one is John Brown, and the other was a Muslim Indian man whose name I cannot remember off the top of my head. John Brown was a Scotsman, and there were lots of rumors that there was a romantic relationship between her and Brown, and later in life, her and the Indian man. But there's not, especially with the Indian man, there's not much to show it. She was very, very fond of Brown. There's no evidence that they ever had a physical relationship, but she was very fond of the man, and probably was in love with him. As a young queen, oddly, she wasn't very popular. People thought that she was a bit petty and childish and spoiled, and she had been secluded for most of her childhood, and so people didn't really know her, and so she wasn't terribly popular. But then she was, after she got married and she was pregnant with her first child, who would be her daughter Victoria, there was an assassination attempt on her by a guy named Oxford, and although he fired two shots, nobody knows where the bullets went. She wasn't hit, um, and they grabbed the guy. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity because he was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. But anyway, after that, her popularity soared. People felt a lot of sympathy for her and everything. You know, this poor woman who was pregnant and this man trying to kill her and all of that. So her popularity soars as a result of that. Um, and she will, for most of her reign, she's pretty popular. Like I said, there were some scandals, and there were some, there's some highs and lows in her reign of her popularity, but overall, she was a very popular monarch. Okay, so this chart shows how Queen Victoria became the Queen of England, and it starts with George III, and you notice he's in a red block. The red blocks mean that they were a monarch of Great Britain. And you'll notice that there are also some sort of yellowish orange blocks. That means the monarch of Hanover. You see, because starting with George the First, who was George the Third's great grandfather, the King of England was actually from Hanover. There was a break in the line, and so they had to go to a cousin, and the cousin happened to be King of Hanover. That would be George the First. And so he became King of England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. He claimed France. George III doesn't. And Hanover. So anyway, so that's why they're called the Hanoverian kings or the Hanoverian dynasty, the Hanover dynasty. So George III and his wife Charlotte have 15 children. 15. A lot of them. 9 boys and 6 girls. And so when he dies in 1820, his eldest son becomes George IV, just like normal, right? Uh, and then when he dies, the problem is his daughter has already passed. He only had one legitimate daughter, Charlotte Augusta, and she has already died. She died 13 years before he did. So George IV is dead. Charlotte Augusta, no longer a living. So now we go to the next oldest brother, who would be Frederick, except Frederick has also died. He died in 1827. And so Frederick gets skipped, and it goes to brother William. And William becomes King William IV, and he'll reign for 7 years. Now, part of the reason these guys have such short reigns is that their father, George III, had a very long reign. He is the third longest reigning monarch of Britain. And at the time, he was the longest. So William IV has a few children by his wife. He has lots of illegitimate children, but he only has 4 by his wife, and only 2 of them are live born. So his first child is Charlotte. She was born and died on the same day, March 21st of 1819. And his second daughter, Elizabeth, died at about 9 or 10 months old. So she didn't live very long either. And then, unfortunately, his wife had a few stillbirths as well. Um, anyway, so William IV has no legitimate children. So when he dies in 1837, normally it would go to the next eldest brother, who is Edward. Except Edward is already dead as well. He died in 1820. But Edward has a legitimate child who is still alive in 1837. And so that child, who happens to be female, he only had one child. If he'd had a son, if he'd had two children and one of them was a boy, the boy, older or younger, would have inherited first. Okay, male preference under the English laws, or at that time. That has been changed as of the birth of Prince William's son, Prince George. Right before he was born, they changed the succession laws to be first child, not first son and then daughters. Anyway, so Edward's daughter is Alexandrina Victoria of Hanover, and she becomes Queen Victoria the First. Now, she does not become Queen of Hanover, and the reason for that is that Hanover is under an old set of laws called the Salic laws. It's a German line of succession law that says females cannot inherit the throne. And so what happens is when William IV dies, it goes to his next eldest living brother. It skips over Victoria because she is ineligible because she's female. And so Ernest Augustus becomes King of Hanover, and then his son George becomes King of Hanover after that. And then in 1870, he basically loses his title when Germany unites. So Victoria becomes queen, and she becomes queen at a very young age, as we mentioned, marries her cousin, has 9 children. The eldest male of which, Edward VII, becomes king on her death in 1901. He doesn't get a very long reign because, well, his mama lives a very long time and is the longest reigning monarch of Britain at the time of her death. So she outpaces her grandfather, George III, and will be the longest ruling monarch of England until her great great granddaughter, I think it is, Elizabeth I, surpassed her back in 2015. So during her reign, one of the things that changes is that the old political parties are going to regroup, rename themselves, sort of reinvent themselves. Benjamin Disraeli, who was the first Jewish prime minister, by the way, will create the modern day Conservative Party of the United Kingdom from the old Tories. William Gladstone will take the Whigs and convert them into the Liberals. And Disraeli and Gladstone are basically, for about 15, 20 years, the prime ministership shifts between the two of them, back and forth. Both worked towards political reforms. Both wanted to expand suffrage. By the end of the 19th century, most men had the vote. Other Chartist ideas, like the secret ballot, had been implemented. The rotten boroughs were gone. All of those good things had happened. Shortly after Victoria's death in 1901, the House of Commons will pass laws which force reforms, eliminating most of the power of the House of Lords. And from that point on, really the House of Lords, it's not a total rubber stamp organization. It still exists. It still has some authority and some powers, but the House of Commons is absolutely in charge from that point forward. And so during this era, what we're seeing in Britain is a whole lot of reforms. The middle class merchants are going to start pushing laissez faire economics and free trade. They're going to get rid of their old mercantilist system because they see that they're going to stop supporting that concept because they see that it's actually preventing them from making money trading with other nations colonies and things. And so they're going to support the idea that there should be no limitations on trade at all. Anti-slavery becomes a big thing for the British. Slavery had never been popular in England itself. It had been outlawed there for a long time. Um, they banned the trade internationally in 1807. This is how powerful Britain is getting, is that they say nobody's allowed to go to Africa and take slaves anymore. And they start enforcing it with their navy, and would take slave ships from other countries and return them to Africa and things. So yeah, I mean, it was a big deal. The English had long said that the air of England was too pure for slaves to breathe. And so when a slave was brought to the United Kingdom, they were immediately freed. As soon as they set foot on English soil, they were free. Um, they will finally ban the practice in all of their colonies in 1833. So that takes a little bit longer to convince the colonies, especially those sugar islands in the Caribbean, to ban the practice. It takes a while. They have all kinds of criminal and penal reforms. They reduced the number of capital offenses from over 200 different things. You could be executed under the old system for stealing anything the value of a shilling. A shilling was not a lot of money. Think like 50 bucks. If you stole something worth $50, you could be hanged for it back in those days in England. And so they get rid of that, and they change it to where the capital offenses would only be, let's see, what was it? It was treason, murder, rape, and I don't remember the other, but it was something along those lines. You had to really, really do something pretty bad. They introduced the concept of transportation of criminals. This is how Australia, for example, begins to be populated, as they start sending their criminals to Australia during this era. Well, they'd started a little earlier, but it becomes very popular in the 1800s. They built all sorts of new prisons, and they outlawed imprisonment for debts. So no longer will you be locked up for owing money that you can't pay, which makes sense, because if you're locked up, how are you supposed to make money to pay off your debts? The working class has been growing in leaps and bounds with industrialization, and now the majority of people in England were working class, and they demanded reforms because there's a lot of them, and now they can vote. More and more of them are able to vote, and so they can influence all of these things. They start demanding limited working hours and get it. They get the legalization of trade unions. They get improved safety conditions. They get minimum wages. They start setting limits on child labor. They get public elementary educations instituted, at least through about the equivalent of fourth or fifth grade for everybody, paid for with your taxes. They begin to have health insurance programs that regular people could afford, unemployment insurance, all of these things. And because of this, because of the reforms that the working class has already managed to get in England, the working class in England, although they weren't wealthy, okay, don't think that they're wealthy. They were poor, and they worked very hard and long hours all through the century and everything, but they had clout, they had authority, and they used it. They absolutely used it. And what they do is they create their own political party, and it's the third of the major political parties now in the United Kingdom. It's the Labour Party. And interestingly, these workers don't really take into Marxism. Karl Marx, who had written his Communist Manifesto in England because he was in exile from Germany when he wrote it, the Germans didn't want any of that nonsense being spread, so they kicked him out. So they didn't pick up on his ideas of socialism and communism, because honestly, they didn't need it. They were doing pretty darn well with the system they had. And as you all know, if the system looks like it's working for you, you don't want to change it because then the new system might not. So by the early 1900s, almost every British man could vote, but not a single woman could. The suffragists, these are the women who supported women's suffrage, at first tried peaceful protests, marches, and things like that. But really, they didn't get a lot of public interest in their movement. They were kind of a joke, honestly. People laughed at them. Um, then they started to move to more radical and violent methods. A woman by the name of Emmeline Pankhurst led this. Um, they did things like interrupting parliamentary debates. The parliamentary debate was open to the public. And so they would go and in the middle of some member of parliament giving his speech, they would stand up and start chanting, votes for women, votes for women. They would, during their marches, instead of just quietly and peacefully marching down the street, they started smashing windows. They even burned some buildings. Emmeline Pankhurst even went so far as to hire, I believe it was judo experts, it was some form of Eastern martial art, to teach her and many of the other women in the movement, the suffragist movement, judo or karate or whichever it was, I don't recall, so that they wouldn't need to carry a weapon, but they'd still be able to defend themselves when they got all rowdy and the cops came and they didn't want to get arrested, so they'd like throw the cops around using judo. Uh, Now all of this rowdiness and violence, this is not respectable. And so a lot of the middle class women are going to turn away from this movement because of that. They don't want to taint their family with this idea of being disreputable. And so that actually hurts their movement. While it gets headlines and people know there's women out there struggling for the right to vote because of all of this sort of craziness and things that the women are doing, um, it backfires in that it makes it look radical and crazy rather than it being some sort of reasoned debate about, hey, this is how things ought to be. And so I think that actually puts things off a bit. It won't be until 1918 that Parliament will start granting women the right to vote. And even then, they only granted women over the age of 30 the right to vote. The idea being, although men could vote at 21, women took longer to emotionally mature and take over, not be as controlled by their emotions, which we all know is a bunch of bunk, but that's what they believed then. It'll be, I believe, the 1940s, maybe the 1930s, before they give women the right to vote at the same age as men. So with all of these changes going on, next question is Ireland. What's going on there? Hopefully y'all are aware of something called the Irish potato famine, and that's going to take place during this era. Britain had ruled Ireland since the 1100s. It had been colonized by Protestants from Scotland and England. The Irish, who are Catholics almost exclusively, never really accepted British rule. They didn't like it. Absentee landlords, people living in England and Scotland, typically owned most of the land, certainly all of the good land. The Irish worked it as tenants. They were tenant farmers who had very few rights. The landlords grew wealthy. The Irish peasants remained poor. The only the only places they were allowed to grow food for themselves was in the poorer, worse soils and things. The good land was reserved for growing grains that were then sold to England and taken out of Ireland. This is part of what's going to cause the potato famine. Britain's going to slowly move in reform of Ireland. They won't even let Irish Catholics vote until 1829. And even then, you had to own property, which, of course, most Irish peasant tenant farmers didn't own. Now, the Irish tried several times to revolt against this and gain self-rule. They formed an organization known as the Fenian Brotherhood, several armed rebellions, all of them put down rather bloodily. The moderates are going to use political means. And in 1914, just on the eve of World War I, just as it's getting started, Parliament will pass a Home Rule Bill. but it doesn't go into effect because of the war. And so it's going to delay things a bit. Okay, so during this era, that one of the worst things that's going to happen in Irish history takes place, and it's known as the Potato Famine or the Great Hunger. And what happens is that a fungus gets into the potato crops, and it's very contagious and very long lasting. It gets into the soil and is persistent. And what it does is it rots potatoes while they're in the ground, and it kills off most of the potatoes. Now, the Irish, who have been the Irish tenant farmers, the majority of the people, they live off potatoes. Okay, the areas that they're allowed to grow food in for themselves, the gardens that they grow, are pretty poor soil, and potatoes are one of the few things that will grow well in them. And so when this fungus hits and it kills most of the potatoes, that means that they lose most of their food. And it's going to starve 1 million people to death. Well, between starvation and disease caused by starvation, lack of proper nutrients, people are dying of scurvy and things. It's going to kill 1 million people, and another million or so sell off everything they own and escape, most of them coming to the United States or going across to England. As many came to the United States as possible. The Irish blame the British for it, not for the disease itself, but they blame the British for all of the death, because British landlords, those absentee landlords that have these farmers still working on their crops in growing wheat and corn and stuff, those things are still being shipped out of Ireland because they can get a higher price in England or wherever they're selling them than they can get in Ireland, where the people just don't have any money to buy it. And this is still a cause for a lot of bitterness between many of the Irish and, in particular, the English, but the Scotch and the Welsh as well. And so now we're going to return to France and the Second Empire. The First Empire, of course, was Napoleon Bonaparte, and we've gone over all of that before. So now we have the Second Empire when Louis Napoleon becomes Napoleon III. And he was really popular with the bourgeoisie, the middle class, because they thought he would restore order and prosperity and things. And he's very popular with the working classes because they thought he was going to end poverty for them. Now, he worked towards those things, but you don't see it just disappearing. Napoleon III rules basically as a dictator. Now, the National Assembly exists, so there's the trappings of a democracy that people vote for assembly members and all of that. But the fact is, they have no power, no authority. Basically, everything is as Napoleon III wants it. One of the things he is going to do, though, is promote industrial development and commercial ventures, and that is going to help people out. That's going to help France make a lot of money. It's going to put the workers to work. It's going to keep the farmers busy feeding all of these industrial workers. And so he does help the working classes in that. And he does a fairly good job with those things. With industrial ventures and commercial ventures. It's during his reign that they'll, for example, dig the Suez Canal, which is designed by a fellow by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps. But in foreign affairs, he's not good. He's going to place Maximilian I on the throne of Mexico until that collapses. Then he's going to accidentally help unite Italy, something he didn't want to happen, and yet it will happen while he's ruling. He gets involved in the Crimean War, and while they win, That's largely because the British are there, not because the French. Not that the French fought poorly, just they were poorly organized, poorly trained, they poorly equipped. They don't really gain anything from it, and then of course they fight that war against Prussia that we've talked about, the Franco-Prussian War, which they lose disastrously and humiliatingly, and which led to the end of the Second Empire. And here we have some images of that Second Empire. The gentleman to the left, that's His Imperial Majesty Napoleon III, of course, dressed in military uniform um, of a field marshal with the royal scepter and crown and the ermine robes, all of these things indicating royalty and power and authority. And the fellow at the bottom, that's Maximilian the First of Mexico, who Napoleon III put on the throne of Mexico. The French basically sent troops over to Mexico and took over because Mexico owed them money. And this happens during the American Civil War, while America is too preoccupied with our Civil War to do anything about this violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Um, Maximilian I've always felt bad for him because he really got the short end of the stick here. Max had to be convinced to go. When he got there, he refused to be a complete puppet. He tried to do his best for what he thought would do the best for Mexico. And yet, as soon as the American Civil War is over and they tell the French, you better get out of Mexico, the French withdraw their troops from Mexico, and almost immediately his government collapses. He himself is captured and executed by the rebels who are trying to overthrow this puppet monarch from outside. But I always thought that he kind of got the short end of the stick on that. He really tried to do his best. The photo of the building, that house there, that is an example of Second Empire architecture, which is still kind of a popular look. This house was actually built back in the Second Empire, back in the mid to late 1800s, but the style, you still see it around, particularly in some of the higher end, wealthier shishi neighborhoods, because it's not a particularly inexpensive way to build a house. Okay, so the Third Republic is going to come after the Second Empire. It's founded after Napoleon III was captured in the Franco-Prussian War. The French refused to surrender. They say, okay, well, you have our emperor, fine. We're not an empire anymore. We're taking things back into our own hands. And the government becomes a republic again. However, they still lose the war and are then forced to accept the Germans' peace terms in 1871. Which we've talked about all that. The rebels inside Paris will set up something called the Paris Commune, and they become known as communards. And this is, by the way, where we get the term communism from. And these communards swear to defend the republic from the aristocracy. The National Assembly sends in the troops to suppress the communard movement. They kill about 20,000 people in a pretty short civil war that basically takes place in Paris and its surroundings. But the more radical folks in Paris rose up against the Republic government, and the Republic government crushed them. So how well did the Third Republic work? Not terribly, although it will last for quite a while. Uh, so it's a new republic. They get a new government. They have a bicameral legislature, universal male suffrage. They had two houses there for bicameral: the Chamber of Deputies, which was the lower house and is the most powerful of the two, and the Senate, which is the upper house. They have an indirectly elected president who is just a figurehead. He's the head of state, but has no real power. And they have the premier, who is the guy who kind of runs Chamber of Deputies, and he's the one who's got all the real authority and power. So he's the head of government, really. The problem that the Third Republic has is that it's a republic and it's in France. And the French are just a really, truly fragmented bunch of people. And they have dozens and dozens of political parties. Uh, None of them anywhere near large enough to gain dominance. Like here in America, we have a two-party system. Basically, we have other parties, but none of them are big, really. And so the power shifts between the Republicans and the Democrats. Over there, they've got a million different political parties. And so, in order for one of them to take over the government, they really can't do that. So they have to form coalitions where parties will ally with each other. They make deals with each other and they say, okay, if we make the government, if you'll help us form a government, then, which had to be done by having the majority of the members of the Chamber of Deputies support it. If our leader gets to be the premier, we'll make your leader the head of the army because you're big on the army, and we'll make the leader of this party, which is big on social services, the head of the social services departments, and so on and so on. Okay. Now, once each coalition had enough votes, it can do that. It can name a premier and form a government. But they're really unstable because as soon as somebody in the coalition does something that irritates another party in the coalitions fall apart and the government falls. And they have to go through it all over again. And it's so unstable that they will go through 50 governments in 10 years. Can you imagine having 50 different changes of leadership in 10 years? That's 5 a year on average. That's every couple of months. Nothing can get done. You just barely have the job before you're out of it again, which means your policies that you just barely get started doing never get completed. And so for 10 years, a straight 10 years, it's just utter chaos for the Third Republic. This system is going to continue, however, from the 1870s until World War II, until after World War II in 1945, when they create a new French government. And it's just insanity. The Third Republic is also rocked with many, many scandals, and probably the worst of it was known as the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus was a high-ranking officer who was accused and convicted of being a spy, imprisoned on Devil's Island, which was sort of their version of Australia, except it was much smaller, and it's over in the Atlantic. It's this little tiny island, and it's terrible. His trial is highly irregular. Basically, he wasn't really guilty. Much of the evidence was badly forged against him. Basically, he pissed off the wrong people in the army, and they went and they got him. The real thing that it was the problem was he was Jewish. And there were people in the army who didn't like that this Jewish guy had risen to a level of authority. And it's obviously an unfair trial, and that splits French society. One of the effects it's going to have is it's going to help create the modern Zionist movement. Zionism is the idea that there needs to be a Jewish state in Palestine. And it begins to catch on more and more as a result of the Dreyfus Affair and other things going on in Europe. Oddly enough, at the time, the best place to be a Jew in Europe was Germany. They had virtually no restrictions on Jews in Germany in the late 19th century through most of the early 1900s. And so that was odd. But a lot of French citizens supported Dreyfus, and the most famous of them is a writer named Émile Zola, who famously wrote an article for the newspaper entitled J'accuse, which means I accuse. And he says the army is hiding the truth, and goes to show how they did it. Zola will be put on trial and convicted of libel, and he has to run from France to avoid being imprisoned. The funny thing is, it's not libel, it was true. The secret word is star, S-T-A-R, star. Remember that. So, meanwhile, over here in the USA, what's going on? Well, we are expanding like crazy. In 1803, we buy the Louisiana Purchase. In 1819, we get Florida from Spain. 1845, Texas joins the Union. The next year, Oregon becomes officially part of our country as we draw a border between Oregon and Canada in an agreement with Britain. 1848, we're going to gain the Mexican cession as a result of the war with Mexico, which was ended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. 1853, the Gadsden Purchase purchases the last little bit of what is now the continental 48 states. So that hasn't changed since 1853. It's that little teeny bit of southern New Mexico and Arizona, which you'll see on a map here in a moment. 1867, we buy Alaska from Russia. It was known as Seward's Folly. The Secretary of State at the time who garnered the deal was a man named Seward. And he was mocked for it because there wasn't really anything there. And a few years later, they find gold. And then a little bit later, they find oil. And everybody believes that he's a freaking genius because we got a great deal on it considering how much wealth we've pulled out of it. And in 1898, we will annex the independent kingdom of Hawaii. And at that point, we have all of the territory that makes up the 50 states we have now. And here's a map of that growth up till 1853. So it doesn't include Alaska or Hawaii. Now, not all of these places became states immediately, obviously. Hopefully you knew that. But this is a map, if I were you, I would study quite carefully because you never know, it might appear somewhere else later, like on a test. Hint, hint. So the United States in 1800 was by far the most liberal nation in the world in terms of who could vote, and so therefore the most democratic nation in the world. However, it was still very limited. Only about 20 to 25% of the population could vote. That is, only property-owning men over 21. The states determined what requirements there were to vote. The Constitution did not. The Constitution does now have certain amendments to it that say you can't deny someone the right to vote based on certain categories, certain protected categories. Now that includes gender, age, if you're under the age of, as long as you're 18 and over, race. Those have all been eliminated since the 1800s. But at the time, the states did that determining. Many of them specifically outlawed women voting. Many of them specifically outlawed non-whites from voting, but not all of them. Some of them simply, they all had a property requirement. Virtually all the states had a property requirement. And that, generally speaking, eliminated women who in a lot of states weren't allowed to own property. And of course, slaves who were property themselves and could not, actually weren't legally considered citizens either. So, yeah, it sort of still cuts out huge chunks of the population. And yet, that's still the most democratic society in the world. By the 1832 elections, most of the property requirements had been eliminated. There were still a couple of states that had some, but they had well reduced them, increasing Democratic participation to not quite 50% of the adult population. At the same time, the expanding, there was a second Great Awakening. It's a religious revival that's going to lead to a lot of reform movements in the early 1800s, including abolitionism, the desire to abolish the institution of slavery, the temperance movement, where they wanted to get rid of the consumption of alcohol largely because of all the other social problems that came with the truly incredibly huge amounts of alcohol people drank back in those days. And women's suffrage was another one of the reform movements that starts up in the mid 1800s. It'll eventually become successful in the early 1900s. All right, so the American Civil War is going to take place during this era as well. And it's caused by economic and cultural differences, splitting the United States apart. Basically, you have one country set of borders, but two separate cultures and really two separate nations within those borders. And that's simply just not going to continue. That just can't last. And so in December of 1860, 7 states will secede from the Union and form their own country, the Confederate States of America. 4 more will secede in the early part of 1861, making a total of 11 states. Now, Abraham Lincoln is the president at the time, and he has to lead the United States in a war to fight to reunite the country. And the war takes 4 years. It's an incredibly bloody affair. You have newer weapons being used with old methods of fighting, old tactics with new weapons, and that always leads to a lot more lives being lost. Same thing will happen during World War I, where they use old tactics versus new weapons, and it ends up being a bloodbath. And the Civil War is the bloodiest war that America has ever fought by a long stretch. As a matter of fact, if you don't include World War II, and you add all the others up, they're altogether not as bad as the Civil War was. World War II thrown in there does take it over, but it's over 600,000 dead Americans in the Civil War, so it's pretty bad. The result, of course, hopefully you know, is the end of slavery in the United States, but that's not the end of trouble. African Americans would still face lots of segregation and other legal and economic and social barriers, some of which go on till today. Unfortunately, the good news is things are better than they used to be. The bad news is we still have some improving to do on all of that. So, economically speaking, what's going on in the United States is that the U.S. is industrializing very rapidly, faster than any other country does, except for probably Japan. When Japan finally gets around to doing it, they industrialize incredibly quickly. That's largely because we had a huge, huge country that was just full of natural resources. We had everything that was necessary. We had coal, we had iron, we had wood, we had food, we had just everything. We had manpower, all of it. We had a laissez-faire economy, meaning that the government pretty much stayed out of it and let them grow. And while that's bad in some ways, there was not a lot of protection for consumers and workers. Their rights as consumers and workers. It does allow some people to make a huge amount of money, which spurs them into reinvesting it into more growth. As in Europe, we get a widening gap between the rich and the poor. You also get a growing middle class. In 1800, about 10% of the population owned about 40% of the property. By 1870, that's more like 10% had about 70% of the property. So that's growing. We have huge immigration. Lots of immigrants start arriving during this era. The potato famine, the Great Hunger in Ireland, drives a million Irish to the United States. We have, as a result of the gold rush and the Transcontinental Railroad, you get a bunch of Chinese into California. And also as a result of the gold rush, you get people from really all over the world coming to America. And that takes place in the 1840s, 1848, 1849 is when it begins. And it goes on for a solid decade. And just tens of thousands of people go pouring into all of this. And so these immigrants provide the labor, or a bunch of the labor, for these growing industries. But there are some pretty serious problems that are growing in American society, and they're often overlooked because of the people preferred to look at the success stories, the men and women in some cases, but mostly men who came from rags to riches, went and became immensely wealthy. Andrew Carnegie, who became one of the wealthiest men in the world worth hundreds of billions of dollars in modern terms. Yes, hundreds of billions of dollars, like about triple what Jeff Bezos is worth in modern terms, arrived in the United States as a young boy with literally nothing but the clothes on his back. And but because of the immense and very obvious wealth of a few people and the fact that that's what people tended to concentrate on rather than the problems that were sort of under the surface, it gets known, the last part of the 19th century is often known as the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain. Gilded means to be covered with gold. And it's a process where they take something and maybe it's really made out of lead or iron, and then they put a thin layer of gold over the top of it so it looks and weighs and feels in your hands as if it was made of solid gold. But in fact, it's just on the outside that it's gold and pretty and valuable, and underneath, if you look underneath that top layer, you'll see that it's not. It's something less beautiful underneath. That's where the term comes from. So there were some very serious problems going on in America at the time. So what happens in the last part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, is that people do start to look a little bit below that golden layer and see that there are problems and then decide that they're going to fix them. People like Theodore Roosevelt, who becomes president of the United States, another president, Woodrow Wilson. These men are what are known as progressives. They want to change America for the better. And of course, it's their idea of what's better, but still, that's their goal. And they find a lot of people that want to do that as well. Once these problems start getting pointed out, people start saying, well, we got to fix these. This is America. We're not going to have this kind of bad stuff going on. One of the outgrowths of that is a political idea called populism. And this is the idea that the job of the government and politics is to look out for the common man, the little guy. And this becomes a very popular and powerful political theme, and it still is. Populism is still a very popular message that politicians, especially people running for high offices like governors and presidents and things like that, they want you to think that they want you to identify with them. It's called identity politics. But the idea is they want to get across the idea that they're just like you. They're one of the guys. They understand your problems. And so they want to fix your problems because they understand what they are. And really, probably the best guy at doing this recently was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was very good at conveying that feeling to people. Anyway, so the populists come out and they start these progressive reforms. They start passing new laws to help protect workers that require shorter working hours and safer conditions, less child labor, things like that. That promote labor unions, which is going to help raise wages some. They start to pass laws that prevent the formation of trusts, essentially monopolies in businesses. This included a law called the Sherman Antitrust Act. There's others, but the Sherman Antitrust Act is the most famous of them all. Still, other regulations helped to protect consumers. So they're starting to regulate that laissez-faire sort of attitude, that leave it alone. That's what laissez-faire means, by the way. Leave it alone attitude that the government had towards businesses pretty much throughout the 1800s. And part of the reason for that is a famous book called The Jungle by a man named Upton Sinclair. And it's interesting because when he wrote the book, he wasn't trying to draw attention to the dangers to the public of the meatpacking industry, which is where the story is set. It's set in a meatpacking plant in Chicago. It was originally supposed to make people feel bad about the conditions in which the immigrant workers found themselves, the poor immigrant workers found themselves. But what it mainly did was it disgusted people when they found out how all of the things that were going on in the plant were. It's pretty gross. I mean, if you like gross reading, that book should be on your list. but it helped push through Congress a law that creates the Federal Food and Drug Administration that helps to make sure that the food that we eat is actually food and not other stuff in it, and that the medicines we drink and consume are actually medicines that actually do what they say they'll do and don't have more negative side effects than positive benefits and things like that. Another progressive reform that's going to take place is that women are going to gain the right to vote throughout the United States in 1920, when the 19th Amendment is passed, and that says that you cannot deny a person the right to vote because of their gender. Or does it say sex? It says sex or gender one, I'm not sure. Technically two different things. Now, pretty much through the 19th century, through the 1800s, the United States has pursued a foreign policy of isolationism. That means basically that they don't get involved in the affairs of other countries. Partly that's because of a warning that the first president of the United States, George Washington, made when he left office in what was known as his farewell address. He cautioned the United States, the leaders that would be following after him, to avoid two things. One was forming political parties, and it was really too late for that. It had already happened. The other was getting involved in getting tied up in other countries' affairs. He called it entangled. He said to avoid becoming entangled in the affairs of other nations. And that was because the United States was a small, poor, weak country at the time and would have been crushed had it gotten in between some of these big European nations. And although we had a lot of pride, we didn't have a lot of force on our side. Now, by the end of the 1800s, by the end of the 19th century, the United States is, for the first time, really sort of abandoning that. And in 1898, we'll have an overseas war against the Spanish, and we take away several of their possessions as a result of winning this war, and makes us basically an empire in everything except name. When we take Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines away from Spain, and we take Cuba away from Spain as well, but we make Cuba an independent country. They're not really independent because we have a lot of hooks in them that sort of keep them from being able to do whatever they want. They sort of become a puppet state for the United States. But we've become an empire as a result of this, of the Spanish-American War. In 1903, we get the rights to build the Panama Canal away from the French and the British who had started it. And we finish it up, and we interfere left, right, and center in Latin America and Central America throughout the early part of the 1900s and really up until modern times. And in 1905, the president, Theodore Roosevelt, will get involved mediating a peace treaty between the Russians and the Japanese, helping to end the Russo-Japanese War, which earns him, by the way, a Nobel Peace Prize for being the guy who mediates that. But that's one of those sorts of things that major powers do, is that they help mediate between other powers as a sort of neutral, disinterested third party. And so these are all kind of steps, not only out of isolationism, but towards becoming a really, honest to goodness, major power, along with the likes of France and Russia and Britain especially, Germany, and other of the big countries of the world. And so as the 19th century turns over to the 20th century, as we go from the 1800s to the 1900s, we see the United States spreading out over a very large area, the Samoan Islands and the Carolinas and just all sorts of places, all the way from, as this cartoon shows, Manila in the Philippines, across to Puerto Rico, which they misspelled, in the Caribbean. 10,000 miles from tip to tip under the shadow of the American Eagle's wings. And that's where we're going to call it for today. I hope you've liked this one. There should be a quiz up very soon, and we will get on to chapter 25. So go ahead and read chapter 25 as well. And next week we'll do chapter 25. And next Thursday, we will be taking our next test. Okay, so that'll be over chapters 23, 24, and 25. Until then, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.